All right, this is lecture 22, Microbiology, Part 2. We're continuing with diseases of the digestive system. This is now we're on to viral diseases of the digestive system. Uh, well, the first is mumps. Mumps virus is transmitted by saliva and also by respiratory released secretions. It enters through the respiratory tract and infects the salivary glands, which are, after all, accessory digestive organs. It infects particularly the parotid salivary glands and causes swelling under the jawbone. It is prevented by the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, MMR vaccine. It's the second M in measles, mumps, rubella. The next disease I'm not saying much about it. We have limited amounts of time. I do want to talk about hepatitis. Hepatitis is inflammation of the liver. It is not one particular disease. It can be caused by a number of different viruses or even by drugs that injure the lungs or chemical compounds that can cause toxicity to the, not lungs, liver. Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus can cause hepatitis, but one of the major causes are the hepatitis viruses. The key viruses are the human hepatitis A, B, and C, which are the ones that I would particularly want you to know about. These are treatable or preventable, rather. Hepatitis A and B are quite preventable by vaccine. The hepatitis A vaccine involves using an inactivated virus as the antigen. Hepatitis B, the vaccine contains a protein that is found on the surface of the virus. It's called the hepatitis B surface antigen. The gene coding for that from the virus was cloned and expressed in eukaryotic cells and and is purified from those cells. Perfectly safe. It's an excellent example of and a very early example. It was, I think, first available in the 1980s. Excellent example of the power and usefulness of recombinant DNA technology. Preventable by this vaccine. Hepatitis C, there is no vaccine available. However, there is a very effective treatment now that has been developed, I believe, over the past 10 years. And it's an expensive short-term treatment, well worth the expense, I would say, because it's 100% effective. Pretty much 100% effective. The hepatitis, in terms of hepatitis B, the hepatitis B virus is an enveloped virus. There are proteins, viral proteins expressed on the envelope. Remember, an envelope from around a virus is derived from the cell that was the host cell that the virus had infected, took over the cell machinery, started producing virus nucleic acid, in this case DNA, and viral proteins. And some of the viral proteins get expressed on the surface membrane. And when the virus leaves the cell, it takes part of that envelope viruses. When they leave the cell, they take part of that cell membrane with them, surrounding them, and they have the spike proteins. These spike proteins typically are involved in attachment to, in the process of the virus attaching to a new target cell that it's going to infect. And that's why usually it's the spike proteins, the virally determined spike proteins that are useful target for developing vaccine. Uh, they're used as the antigen in vaccine because if you develop an antibody, it can to them it can block their infectivity. All right, now in terms of gastroenteritis caused by virus, rotavirus is one of the major causes, most common causes of viral gastroenteritis. Gastroenteritis caused by these viruses cause in the United States 3 million cases annually. It has a 1 to 2 day incubation and then followed by 1 week of symptoms of gastroenteritis. Another major cause of gastroenteritis, which is, many people have experienced, is norovirus. It's part of the Norwalk family of viruses, so sometimes you hear it called Norwalk virus, but it is norovirus. It is an acute viral, non-bacterial or viral gastroenteritis. It causes nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain or cramps, and a watery, very loose diarrhea. So you can have both diarrhea and nausea. It is a common cause of localized epidemics. Up to 50% of US adults have been shown to have antibodies, which means that they have at one time or another had an infection of norovirus. So you can see that many people in the population, if you look at American population, well over 300 million, I think it's 350 million population, half of them have at some point had this virus. Very, very easily transmitted. It's transmitted by the fecal-oral route. Short incubation period, so it spreads quickly from one person to the next, and they usually experience 24 hours of diarrhea or vomiting, nausea, and diarrhea, which is worse, obviously, but it can be up to 3 days. Treatment, if required, is rehydration. Outbreaks occur typically in enclosed environments like cruise ships, and I must say that it's something to consider. There have been many cruises in the past that left port, and then after about a week, even though it was a 2-week cruise, they're back in port because so many of the passengers are sick with this virus. Highly contagious within enclosed spaces. It's a problem. Norovirus. Okay, those were viral diseases of the digestive system. There are also some fungal diseases in the digestive system. One example are the fact that and I will only speak generally about this. There are toxins produced by fungus, they're called mycotoxins, it's a general term, that can occur in grains if they're not properly stored, and if fungi are allowed to grow on them, if they get damp, and these can cause serious hallucinations. One type, ergot, can cause serious hallucinations. All of them are called mycotoxins. One type can cause liver damage and even cancer in liver. So grain has to be stored properly, cannot get too damp, otherwise fungus grows on it. All right, let's move on to protozoan or protist diseases that affect the digestive system. There are, in fact, quite a few important ones. We'll start with giardiasis, the disease giardiasis. It's caused by a protozoan called Giardia lamblia, transmitted by fecally contaminated water. Diagnosis for many of these protozoan infections is by examination of stool samples looking for the eggs of the organism. Sometimes it's by looking for the actual growing single-celled organism. Remember that protozoan are eukaryotic organisms. It can be treated, certainly. Often they look for the eggs, but for this one, Giardia, you get this very characteristic it looks like two eyes and these flagella. These are, I believe, nuclei. And the flagella nuclei, maybe not. I'm not sure because it is single-celled after all. But it has a very characteristic look, and when you see that in a stool sample, it's Giardia. Another one is cryptosporidiosis, transmitted by eggs, again in contaminated water, fecally contaminated water. Treated like many gastroenteritis or gastric infections, if the person requires treatment, it's by oral rehydration. Entamoeba histolytica causes amoebic dysentery. This is a single-celled eukaryotic organism, protozoa, that causes dysentery. Dysentery, I remind you, is characterized by diarrhea with blood and mucus. So this is the cause of amoebic dysentery, also called amoebiasis. The amoeba will feed on red blood cells and GI tract tissues, red blood cells from bleeding in the GI tract and the GI tract tissues lining the GI. Diagnosis, again, by looking at the feces and observing the growing organism in this case. So we had Giardia, Lamblia, Entamoeba histolytica, Cryptosporidium. These organisms can cause an ulceration of the normal gut mucosal epithelium and bleeding and damage. Not a happy infection to have. Okay, let's move on to something which is very important, very, very, very widespread, and actually the numbers are shocking. Helminthic or parasitic worm diseases of the digestive tract. There are billions and billions of people in the world, up to a quarter or a third of the world population, who have helminthic or parasitic worm diseases. The three key roundworm or soil contaminating worm infections that you can pick up from soil include these last three, which are Ascaris, hookworm, and these are Trichuris' whipworm, also called whipworm. And you can see these numbers. I mean, almost 1.8 billion, 1.2 billion, just 1.1 billion or 1.1 billion. Many people have multiple infections. It's a serious, serious problem worldwide. Here you see 30, 20, and almost 20, multiple. Some people have more than one infection, so it's not, you don't add this up. Not each person has only one. These are debilitating diseases that rob people of proper nutrition and health, weaken them, cause them to be more susceptible to malnutrition and other disease problems. These are more recent statistics. I'm going to go show you also some older statistics, and the older ones from your textbook leave out whipworm or Trichuris, but it's just unbelievable how many people in the world carry these. I believe the statistic is that 30 to 50% of individuals in the world carry some kind of parasitic worm infections in the digestive system. In Canada, according to the National Health Survey, and these are recent statistics, around 6% of the population has soil-transmitted worm infections. Worm infections, round worm infections, or any worm infection is called helminthiasis. Remember, the one important thing is 6% are self-reported as having a parasitic worm. There could be a significantly larger number of people who have not been diagnosed. It is, in fact, estimated that soil transmitted infections are an important problem. It's not. It's a worldwide thing. Certainly, Canada has a lower percentage than other places, but a significantly high percentage. These are the soil transmitted ones. Here I've highlighted the main ones being Ascaris, hookworms, and whipworm or trichuris. Enterobius also is a soil transmitted one. The idea that allowing your little kid to eat soil is okay is not. These are all soil transmitted through eggs deposited in the soil by other humans or sometimes some animals. All right, I'm using somewhat older statistics here from your textbook, but nevertheless, they are fairly accurate. And we'll start with tapeworms. And the percentage of the world population infected here shows 3% of the world's population is infected with tapeworms. The tapeworm genus is Tinea. There's a number of different species that can infect humans. As you can see, multiple species. Transmitted by by larvae. The tapeworm is amazing, as most helminthic or worm infections of the digestive tract are quite amazing reproductive organisms. They have a very simple neural system. They have no visual system. They have no mouth often because they don't need it. They just absorb the digested food from the GI tract that's all around them. Very limited locomotory system. They just attach via these kind of some sort of sucker system here and hooks. And they attach to the wall and then absorb the food as it comes along down the GI tract. They have a very productive reproductive system containing each segment here. Each of these segments contains both male and female reproductive organs. Very handy for solving the problem of where do you meet your sexual partner? Right at home. So they are essentially egg factories. These so-called proglottids refers to each of these sections that get released and will disintegrate and release very, very high numbers of eggs. Eggs are released into the feces and spread by fecal oral or feces in the soil, and then fecal oral route of transmission. Often with tapeworms there is a definitive host, the host in which the adult undergoes sexual reproduction, and then an intermediate host where you have an immature non-reproductive form. But there are different complicated life cycles, none of which I would want you to know. It would only just confuse or mix you up, and they're just too complicated to cover all of them in any decent amount. Mostly it is a digestive tract organism, but it can be present in other places in the body. Here is a tapeworm that is well known to actually, it's in the GI, transmitted by ingesting the eggs, but can end up in the brain and cause, here's a cyst caused by this organism called Echinococcus granulosus, a type of tapeworm. Usually harbored by or carried by in the definitive host, That means the host in which the sexual reproduction occurs are dogs and wolves, carnivores. And the intermediate host normally are sheep, but humans can also pick it up. Sheep and deer can have it. It's a problem. Here's a life cycle showing actually a couple of potential. This is sort of unfortunate. Sometimes the human is intermediate host. Sometimes it's incidental host by accident. But here's the definitive host. Life cycle. Let's move on. 10%. 10% of the human population, giant number of people. We're talking about 500 million people have enterobius infections. Enterobius vermicularis is often called the pinworm. It is a small, approximately 1 centimeter long worm that's found in the GI tract. I believe the male is smaller than the female. We'll see in a second. Definitive host are humans. It'll sexually reproduce in humans. It's transmitted by ingesting the eggs, fecal-oral route of transmission. There is the male, slightly smaller than the female. The female, again, is mostly there. Most of the internal structures are involved, and in the male are involved in reproduction. Mostly filled with ovary, and the ovaries pour out lots and lots of eggs, and those go out in the feces and then are spread by soil transmitted or fecal-oral route indirectly through soil or directly if a person has poor hygiene. Let's go to hookworms. Hookworms, another kind of, I believe, yes, soil transmitted organism. The larvae can hatch in the soil from eggs shed in the feces and then bore through the skin, and they go into the skin and eventually migrate into the intestine. So it's not a fecal-oral route, but by burrowing through the skin of the person that they latch onto. They can then go into the intestine and then hook. They're called a hookworm because of the hook structure that they have, and they'll hook onto the wall of the intestine and sit there and soak up food and shed eggs. And here again, typical kind of structure, some sort of attachment, sucker, hooks. When this has suckers attaching to the wall of the intestine and then absorbing food right through the external epidermis of the organism, just absorption of nutrients. Mostly in this female organism, mostly ovary, producing huge amounts of eggs. And then we get to Ascaris, which is a real problem, and infects is probably the most, no, not probably, is the most commonly occurring parasitic helminth or parasitic worm disease in the world, infecting up to approximately 30% of the human population of the world. And really, this part of malnutrition is parasitic worm infections. Ascaris lumbricoides, problem. It can live in the human intestine, transmitted by eating eggs, food contaminated with the eggs, so a fecal-oral route of contamination, most common. Compromises people's nutritional status. They can become malnourished, can affect cognitive ability. It can cause intestinal obstruction because they're not small organisms. I think we used to do these dissections of them. They were like 6 inches long, and you had to be careful because the eggs were fairly resistant to formaldehyde, and you had to make sure that you wore gloves. We stopped that. So a scaris infection, or a scariasis. And the last one that I want to talk about is trichinella. Trichinella is causes that's the genus name. It causes the disease trichinosis, which is found in pork, in pigs. It's a worm which will burrow into the flesh and form a cyst, a round, hard, dormant state in the muscle of not just pigs, but also humans. It can live in it's alive, but in a cyst form, and is transmitted by eating the flesh of the organism. So if you eat poorly cooked pork that contains the Trichinella spiralis, the spiralis is because it has this spiral shape. This should have been italicized in the name, but there's the genus, there's the species. It's a problem. Burrows in, it can cause serious infections. And here's the life cycle, where a human picks it up by eating pork. Pigs in many parts of the world are just released to eat whatever trash. They'll eat anything, and they'll eat. They're omnivores, and they're often released, and they'll eat trash, waste, and sometimes fecal waste, and waste food, meat that's spoiled, and if it contains the organism, they'll pick it up. And then if you eat undercooked pork from such an animal, it's a problem. Pork here is highly regulated and inspected, but in many parts of the world it's not, and a number of major religions forbid the eating of pork. These are very old rules, for good reason, because they would cause sickness. Okay, so that is the end of the last slide of the lecture 22, part 2, microbiology.